Nau mai, haere mai, and welcome to the Toi Tangata Toi Ako webinar series. Ko Irina Korohina tōku ingoa, ko Ngāti Porou tōku iwi. I am the kaiarahi nutritionist here at Toi Tangata. Toi Tangata is a Māori agency that develops, delivers and champions kaupapa Māori approaches to movement, health and nutrition. If you'd like to find out more, please check us out on our Toi Tangata website. We're at www.toitangata.co.nz or like us on our Facebook page as well. Today we have here with us Dr. Ihirangi Heke. He is currently a Māori health and physical activity consultant involved in a number of projects ranging from community-based initiatives funded by the Ministry of Education and Ministry of Health to working in applied roles with elite athletes as both a sports psychologist and strength conditioner. Also, up in our Toi Tangata offices, we have Dario, our training and development specialist, so Dario Penitito Hemara, to help out Ihi with his kōrero today. And Ihi's going to be giving us a brief introduction to systems dynamics and looking at the whakapapa crossovers. So, without further ado, I will hand you over to Ihi and Dario.
Penitito Hemara hau he uri tēnei no Ngāti Haua ki Waikato i te tau taku whaia, i te tau taku pāpā he uri no te tai tokerau, no Waima ki Ngāpuhi, no reira mihi ana kia koutou.
Tēnā tātou, koine taku mihi karanga kia koutou o kuhua mai ki tēnei. I te ata nei, kia kōrua ngā kaihautu ki tēnei o Toi Tangata koinei te mihi karanga kia kōrua whirino ki tēnā te maha ki tēnei tūmō mahi ngā pūkenga pānake ngā tua me ngā whakapapa tātai whakapapa hoki a tēnā tātou. Well, shall I hook into it? Well, I invited or asked or begged actually my mate Dario to come along and have a sit-in on our talk today because the last time I did a webinar, I got bored stupid because there was no one talking to me and I was talking and thought, this is stink. So what I asked Toi Tangata to do, and I'm humbled that they'd asked me to come along and speak on one of their webinars, but for Dario and for Irina to be able to ask some questions, otherwise I'm not that inspiring, and I got to have motivation and prompting to then think about some of the ideas that I do when I'm out in the taiao, either in the water or up in the mountains. So having people ask questions is kind of critical for this webinar. And I think mainly the reason for that is because now that I'm old, my filing cabinet in my brain doesn't work the same, and so unless you ask a question, the cabinet gets stuck and I can't pull the answer out. So you've got to ask things or I got nothing to say. Or the alternative is that I bloody talk you to death because I get excited about some things.
So there's the challenge, team. Make sure you ask questions.
I do have to put out a special welcome to our mate that's overseas in Canada, to Hariata, ki tōku nei Wānanga, o tēnā o Waikato Tainui. I'm glad that she's doing so well in her new pursuit as one of the lead Māori researchers in Canada. She's leading the way for quite a few of us out of here. So big ups to you, Hariata. You're a shining star. So shall I just begin talking, or Dario can ask some questions, or we can just roll into it, or how do you want to do it?
Yeah, just roll into it. He start talking and then there might be some questions that come through from that.
Okay. Well, I spoke to Megan Tunks from here maybe about a month ago, and she said, would you like to come and do a webinar? And I said, no, not after the last one when I just felt stupid standing there talking to nobody. But she encouraged me to come back, and she said people were particularly interested in systems dynamics and systems thinking. For some of you, you would have heard me talk about this in the past. For those of you that haven't, maybe it's best that I give a bit of background to that and why I've been particularly interested in it. Does that sound right? Mm-hmm. Well, it must be coming up 4 years ago. I met up with a group of academics down in Wellington when I was on a panel for obesity policy for Ministry of Health. Not sure how I ended up there, but I was. It's a pretty powerful table. They were all telling me how well-funded they were and important they were, and I believed them because they had some pretty flash suits on there. And got around to me, and I introduced myself, and got to know the fella sitting next to me a bit better because he said he lives up by where I am, near Mangawhai. He said, I just live over the hill in Pākeri. Turns out this fella's Boyd Swinburne. He was quite a choice fella to talk to. He pushed me hard to try and describe the work that I was doing and said he was struggling with that, not surprisingly. He said, well, it sounds a little bit similar to what happens in a systems context. And I had no understanding of systems. Well, I thought I didn't. So he said, now we're having a conference soon. You need to come along to that. I went to the conference, sat in. After about probably 5 or 10 minutes, I realized what they're talking about was tātai whakapapa, of what environment will cause, or environments will cause in people. And probably not even so much the environments, but the connections, the causal connections between what we see in animate and inanimate environments and what they do to us and what we do to them and the causal outcome of that. So after having a listen to that, figuring out what he was trying to talk about, the more concepts they spoke about from systems, the more sense it made to me. But we just had different words. I felt a little bit stink for them when I said, well, that's mean that you fellas started this in 1970, but we're probably 1,200 years ahead of you because it's been quite a while that we've been practicing these ideas. I think some of the issues from it was that it was seen as quite useful for both parties, mutually beneficial, because they're coming from two cultural bases that allow us to look at each other's work. Because one of the things I pointed out to Boyd fairly early on was we don't play second fiddle to you here. I don't need systems to validate what happens in a whakapapa context. We're fine without you. But if you want to compare and see what happens in the different worlds, I'm okay with that part. So that kicked off an interest in systems that's been rolling along for the last 4 or 5 years. Shall I carry on? Okay. I can't tell because there's no one to talk to, and Dario's just standing here without saying anything, but he better jump in at some point soon. So the systems part that we then pushed on to from the early days of the conferences that were happening was Johns Hopkins University out of Baltimore turned up at Auckland. I went along and listened to them. They were particularly interested in what Māori approaches are to te waiora o tāne, or health. In that in our context, where we differ to mainstream concepts of health is that we don't have people as the center of that process. And this may be news for some Māori out there that haven't heard that concept for a while, because we often prescribe to or try to use systems that aren't ours. And by that I mean that in every other aspect, often we'll stand and speak about our river and our mountain that we come from and show connections to certain districts and work our way down to the individual last. And then when it comes to health, we switch back to a Pākehā context and start talking about ourselves, or people being the centre of that. And that's not typical for us.
Oh, kia ora, Ihi. I do have a question. Somebody's jumped in and they're asking you, can you give us some examples of the application of whakapapa as a system?
Yeah, absolutely. As I get a bit further through here, I'll show you how some of those work.
Cool.
Eamon, eh?
Yeah,
Yeah. Wasn't he down here with us for a while, that fella?
I don't know.
I'm sure I know the bro.
Yep, he says yep.
Bro, get back to work and stop watching webinars. So some of those systems that we then started to look at and use were, that they were using, to be more specific, in a mainstream context. Actually, if I give you even more history behind that, is that where systems dynamics has come from has been managing disease spread. So back in the early 70s there, they were worried about trying to predict how many people in a community might end up being affected by, say, chickenpox, and they couldn't figure out who was going to get it, who would be a carrier, who would die. From that space, they started engaging with computational modelling, which allowed them to load a whole range of factors and then predict where it was going to head. They can also predict backwards. So from a start point of right now, head into the past to figure out what we're seeing now as a contemporary outcome. I've often said that it would have been useful for Auckland to have thought about systems back in the 70s as well, and we wouldn't have the traffic issues we have now, because it's another space that it's used quite often, is that when you have so many roads feeding into a main highway, it's hard to predict what the outcome is going to be 5 k's down the road. Well, we know that one pretty clearly now. So that would have been, it would have been real useful to know that, eh? So I think probably systems has more to benefit from understanding mātauranga Māori, whakapapa and indigenous pathways to looking at causal outcomes or systems or tātai whakapapa, because of our long-standing connection to it, because some still practice it, because those that aren't practicing it and using mainstream approaches are getting poor outcomes, which is fairly strong evidence that, one, it's not a system we've used in the past, and it's not a productive system. So we're having to look at ways of connecting up to environments and understanding what they're going to show in the people we work with. So I think that we have a lot to contribute in this area. And because of that work that came out of, or that first contact with Johns Hopkins, we were invited, me and another colleague, to do a pilot research program that looked at the comparison between whakapapa and systems, which we completed last year. That was working with 2 different locations on how whakapapa concepts could be applied. I think the beauty of whakapapa is that not a lot of our fellows think about it this way, but you use whakapapa a bit?
No. I think most of the kaupapa that we've got going on here, they have a really strong influence in terms of whakapapa. The whakaaro, though, I think for us is the balance between motu versus individual rohe and their mātauranga within the kaupapa, because who are we to go and tell anyone from anywhere what they should be doing or how they should be approaching it. So I think in terms of thinking about certain systems for us, I think it's definitely playing a role that can inspire or lead to further systems being in place that are more specific and relevant to the individual or the hapu that in each area. So
I entirely agree with that. I'm glad this fella's here. I would have forgotten to talk about any of that. Well, he's the man. A couple of things to remember about whakapapa is that often when I talk to different communities, whakapapa is used as a list of names, and they'll show me their whakapapa and say, this is who my grandfather was, this is who my great-grandfather was, and there's just a big list. And it's hard not to be dismissive of that, and I don't know that you should be, but often I'll talk to them and say, look, here's a system of understanding what's caused you to be the way you are, but the names don't matter. It's the lines in between each of the names that cause something to change. And that's the part we need to focus on to figure out why. So it's the combining of a whole range of different names or whakapapa people or ancestors and what they caused. And they caused the person that we see standing in front of us today, or they caused a community to move in a certain way or a pattern that has been predetermined some time ago by the selection of the attributes by that ancestor to invest in the next generation. But what we want to understand is why that happened. Why would they choose those things? What were they intending to have as an outcome if they did that? So I've said this one publicly a couple of times as well, that it might be that exactly what Dario's talking about there of pan-Māori concepts, which are closely connected to kaupapa Māori concepts, that time frame has moved into a new space now where iwi-centered outcomes are more valued. Because tribal groups want to know, They want to know, well, that's mean for those fellas in Tūhoe, but I'm from Waikato, so what does that do? And so a lot of our communities, health workers, kaimahi, are in a space at the moment where they're rushing and fighting and struggling to get their heads around, holy heck, we better know what our version looks like, because those fellas over the border do, apparently. Probably they don't, but they will, and it's coming.
It started the process.
Yeah, and I think what Dario said about who are we to go in and tell them what that should look like, I agree with that entirely. But what we can do as part of Toi Tangata or part of what I do in the consulting role is we can show you frameworks or examples that you then populate with your own. And that's what matters. Because you've got to fill that out and say, well, I don't know what you're talking about. And I say, well, here's a couple of examples of whakapapa physical activity that is specific to that region. So, for example, Eamon was asking, can you give us some examples? Heaps. I'll talk you to bloody death on this if you let me. If you're talking to a Ngāti and they've got a rugby team, for example, then you can afford to take them to the beach and use wave action to figure out what an interval session should look like. But if you're talking with someone that's inland, you've got to use a different whakapapa line to explain how water might move in a river versus how water moves in an ocean. And so the training principles are different as an application. And that's only one application of it. If you choose to follow physical activity, you could follow nutrition, you could follow career development, you could follow relationship development, you can follow anything you want. But I think the important part is that in the past, people have limited communities by generalized approaches, which we needed to get access to political and educational change. But it's limited the perceived outputs or applied outputs to wakaama, maudako, kapahaka. I don't know that was ever the intention. But now that we have a number of different examples, we can apply it however we like. So for example, maybe 10 days ago, I had a bunch of teachers for a PD session. I took them trail bike riding, I took them skiing and snowboarding, and I took them hunting. And from each of those concepts, or locations, I was able to pull out Māori cultural concepts that they could use to underpin the process or the medium they delivered it through. So you can choose anything you want to be able to do that. So I'm really excited about what that looks like. I'm excited about how we can show whakapapa in a different light. Some of you might be surprised to hear this, but I actually wrote some notes today.
Hey, I'm just going to jump in. I've got a couple more questions, if that's all right. We've got Eamon from up north. One of the things we are developing with Hapu and Taitokiro is a kawa waiora. In identifying the tikanga that form the kawa, we are looking at the whakapapa of water and how it changes from when it falls from rangi to rakahore, etc., to when it arrives in the kaipara, and where intervention may be required to maintain waiora, pehia or whakaaro mō tēnei ara.
Main question. You have a shot at first, bro? Well, I can if you don't.
Yeah, good. Start it off.
Well, it's mean that you fellas are looking at what is the kawa for our particular type of waiora that connects to te taitokero. And I think it's going to even come in closer than that eventually. In the next 5 or 7 years maximum, we'll be looking at hapu versions, where there'll be a group of 5 families in one location on one end of the beach that has a different way of approaching the water to a family that might be 20 or 30 k's up the road. So we're going to see quite specific ways of engaging. We see that already. People just don't acknowledge it much. You know, if you go hunting with someone from Ngāti and then you go hunting with someone from Tuwai, they have different processes. Same outcome. You still get fed if you're a good fella and they haven't got crap dogs, you'll still get fed. But it's just a different process. And I think that's real important to know that those things are changing. As far as understanding the kawa of waiora pursuit in your district, and in particular about wai, it's a real interesting area. I put up some videos not long ago about the changing designations, if you want to call it that, of wai from when it leaves the domain of Rangi Nui, maybe through Te Ihirangi, who's our atua connected to rainfall specifically. And for every single thing that water touches on its way down, it will change its potential in terms of modi, or the collection of modi. It's a real interesting one because as it arrives, different form, and there's maybe, I've got a list of 40 different types of wai that we engage with regularly, and you'll know all of them probably. One of the really interesting ones, while I remember it, is the waipipi, or the waipipi or papatuanuku. There's the waipi or tāne as well. Now, this is water that runs underground. And there's a concept there that the waipi or tāne is when water's returned from you when you die, which means that it goes back into the soil, back into the ground. Either way, we have different levels of water. When it arrives, everything that it touches removes another piece of mauri from it. When it eventually gets to the different forms that we see that we get into, which might be, if you're talking rakohore, and depends again on the district, then you're talking about ocean-connected rocks. Kaiho is another one for your interest there, Eamon, about kaiho is the rocks that the wind erodes that then crumble down into the ocean. There's a whole range of different pieces of rock that stick their head up every now and then out of the ocean and then are covered again. The name for the for taumata, you know, the taumata where all your whaikōrero will sit, that's actually the original name for bedrock, from which a lot of these rocks sit on. Ikamatu is another name we see connected to rocks that are just next to rakohore. Those are like reefs that stick their heads up every now and again as well. Not that that's that important to how the water engages with it particularly, but when it comes to water moving, we need rock to give it direction. If we're talking parawhenua mea for sure, because she won't flow as fresh water unless there's the support from rock that give it direction. Otherwise it dissipates, and so does her mana. Coming back to the Māori concept, if we're getting water that's arriving and it's touching certain things, we get into that phase of waimate and waikino. When you're talking about those, the Māori in those spaces, this is bloody interesting stuff in my opinion. I geek out on this, so you've got to ask questions about this, or I just don't remember stuff. But when you're talking about waimate, waikino especially, those are waters where there's currents. Now, for seawater, sometimes we're talking about tiwhanui, mohi, and koko, and sometimes pangaroa that control currents in oceans, and they're different from atura that control currents in fresh water. But if we're talking about waikino, what that in essence is discussing, and these are just some concepts for you fellas that are on there thinking, it's not what we do, but waikino is where the Māori is undefined, which means that if you get in and there's currents there and you're not from that district and you haven't been educated in how to manage that, it can end up in death. Or it can go the other way and end up in being a meantime where you get to body surf down in the currents that form a shape for you to engage with. If your whakapapa line has selected the right attributes for you to be able to apply yourself to that domain. That's waikino. Now, if we go further down, then we're getting into the space of, I hope you're reading emails and not nodding your head at me this way, Miss, by going, nah, that's all shit. But if we follow that further down, and we're talking waimate, this is where it got really interesting, and I put that up on the video, is that all of the Māori has been removed. And that's what we end up with as polluted water. Now, if you have water that's completely polluted, it's had its Māori removed, the danger then is that if you get in it, it's going to remove Māori from you to balance itself. So, if you're asking in your question there about the kawa of waiora and the connection to rakohore and the connection to various types of sea versus freshwater, wai tote, wai Māori, not only they have different domains, but they have different effects on the way that we engage with them and the threat of more or less Māori and what that will cause in us. So I don't know whether that answers your question or not, but I'll hand it over to the breather here and he can have a chat.
I was going to say, just thinking about why in itself is, so do you think, Ihi, that there is a possibility for why to enhance its Māori along a journey when it is flowing through a specific current? Can it pick up and become stronger or more powerful in your opinion as it's going along, or is it already set in its Māori state?
No. That's a cool question, and I don't believe that it is set in its Māori state, which is where you get puna that have travelled underwater as the waipi or papatuanuku to then be forced through and provide different types of potential outcomes in the placement of its Māori and other, not just people, but other living things. So some examples from this one, which is specific to Te Arawa, as far as I know, and from the people I speak to. Different puna we use for different activities. So some we use for physical activities, some for healing, some for thirst, some for cleansing. Pure is a concept that we don't use much anymore these days, of how we cleanse ourselves through water. But sometimes it doesn't mean full immersion in it. It may be that the production of liquid that we have, which is sweat equity when we go and train, is producing another form of liquid that exits us. So it can go in a whole range of different directions. It just depends on how you conceptualize that. But interesting area, and it depends on the district too. And this one might be news to some of you, but depending on the location you live, the focus on different types of water is driven by the environment that has provided sustenance for you for the longest periods. So if you're mountain based, then your whakapapa of water begins from Tāwhiri and coalesces into Waimaori from Te Ihirangi, and then it's the contact with the mountain face that gathers it up and into the first awa. But if you're coastal based, you're going to start from the ocean and head in different directions. There's other groups that start from stars. There's one that talks about Wainui and Tāne being the production or the producers of ngā whetū, marama and Raukawa, which is the only one I've seen of that kind, where stars, moon and sun have been produced by water coupling with Tāne. But unusual one to see. But I think what it says is that there's multiple ways of knowing. And this is not only in terms of multiple ways of knowing as tribes, but multiple ways of knowing in terms of global understandings. And I think that's where systems has been particularly interested in, is that they've been following one way of knowing and thinking, okay, we've got this one tapped. And then they found out there's another group that knows something else.
And is it like looking at the different translations of it as well, potentially? Because the way that one community or that may translate it could be slightly different to others, and even if you're thinking of it in in a more of a global context.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, I don't know that it's necessarily translation, because they exist independently, and I don't know that some of our concepts can be translated as much as they can be sit next to each other as an opportunity for parallel development.
I see.
Yeah, there's just an issue of semantics there, probably, about how you use the words and what they cause. And for Māori, the origin of names that we choose are a big deal. And we haven't even started to look into that one in enough depth yet. But to come back to the concept of systems and whakapapa, why I think that's really interesting is that not only is it not just about the lines that we see between these names, but whakapapa allows us to connect up to things that have happened, to whole eras. For Waikato Tainui, some of our fellows are struggling to think about the idea that anything existed before kingitanga. So whakapapa there is about an era that begins with potatau, or begins with the wherohero, or begins with whichever of those ariki they want to align with, and the influence in their district. So they're quite hard to deal with sometimes, because they don't want to see outside that era of what that whakapapa caused. But the thing that I really like about whakapapa is it allows us to show the conceptual beginning point of an idea. And I think that's where systems thinking got really interested in us, because that's what they're trying to find the root cause of. And, sorry.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to jump in too, because I think there's actually a question here which I think connects in with what you're just saying. They're asking, they're getting a little bit lost when they hear whakapapa without whanaungatanga, and is this a purposeful context of systems dynamics, or is it the same?
I'm just rereading over that. There's probably, well, there is actually, not probably, there's multiple interpretations of which designation you're going to give the concept of whakapapa to. And what I'm using whakapapa in this context for is to show the connection between higher level hierarchical connections of environments to people. You can always use it from people to people to show what that whanaungatanga might look like. But whanaungatanga in this context is spreading it out to a much wider platform, because as iwi, what we've done is we've personified environments, which means we've given them names, we've given them behavior patterns, we've given them characteristics with the intent to be able to connect to them as whānau. And what that allows us to do is to move into those environments without having to ask permission. And this is quite different from a number of other indigenous groups around the world, because in other tangata whenua we see totemism, we see shamanism, we see animism, there used to be paganism, which we don't see so much anymore, and Māori are combinations of all of those. So totemism means that we will have something that represents a thing that we're connected to. Animism means you might follow that particular animal. Paganism is following the cycles of nature, which is what maramataka does for us. And shamanism is where something's directed through a particular person, which is not that dissimilar to tohunga and what they do. And why I'm telling you these things is that we have combinations of all of those so that we can connect on a more personal level, so that we, one, don't disrespect that place, we don't overutilize it, don't take too many resources without thinking about those things, because it's like visiting a family member then. You don't necessarily have to tell them you're coming, but you do have to be respectful for while you're there, mostly. Actually, that never happens with my family, but while you're there visiting, it means that you can understand them a bit better, know the reasons why they're going to do what they're going to do. And that's an ability to follow back the tātai whakapapa from those people that you're visiting with back to what may have caused them to change. So in terms of whanaungatanga, it's as far back as you want to take it. So you can start at a lower level. It depends how you define whanaungatanga too. There's, interestingly, if we look at the semantics of the words around hapu, iwi, and whānau, they mean quite different things as well. You know, where was the birth of an idea is sometimes can be connected to whanaungatanga. It means to give birth. So there's a whole range of different ways of looking at that. I don't know if that's answered their question, but...
Kia ora. Thanks, Ihi. I've got another one here from Jessie. She's asking, how do you work with people brought up disconnected from their whakapapa in terms of the natural environment and hapu and iwi?
2 seconds. Dario will talk to you for a minute while I read back through that last question to make sure I got it covered.
Kia ora.
What's the part again, Irina?
Jessie's wanting to know, how do you work with people brought up who might be disconnected from their whakapapa in terms of the natural environment, hapu and iwi?
I think this is definitely, I think, a space for tautoko to be in their area. I think the example that Eki gave of Waikato and the kingitanga can be a really good way to look into that, because I think some of the rōpū or whānau hapu who have adopted something other than the original whakapapa that they have a connection to, but in saying it doesn't, not to put that aside, but how can you utilize the two to, I guess, enhance the next generation's whakapapa in that process. So I think being from an urban environment can change your perception of things as well. So versus, being down the coast versus the countryside, or being in the metropolis of a place like Tamaki Makaurau can definitely change things, because do you think about the whakapapa of the rohe you're living in, the rohe that you're from, or both? And so some of those who are disconnected probably, I think it just would be to figure out what of the two, or if they want to pursue both of those, is the avenue that they'd like to go down, because you don't want to force anything on anyone, but I think just like he has sort of spoken about before, it's that pan-Māori sort of kaupapa and how it can connect to something else. So I think it's finding that aha moment in terms of how you look to pursue your own haerenga within that space, I guess.
I got to agree with them on that, but I'll just finish off that last question because I read the last part there about whanaungatanga and wondering whether that separation of whanaungatanga from whakapapa was an intended, purposeful process that systems dynamics uses. It's not. What we find with systems is the fundamental aspects of systems are to show connectedness, relationships, and community. And that's no different from how Māori process the intent of whakapapa, which is through tātai whakapapa. It's probably just been because when I speak about whakapapa or mātauranga Māori, I'm often talking about those connections to environments. But that's still a process of whanaungatanga. Now, coming back to the next question about how do we engage with people that don't have that understanding of the environment, I don't have too much trouble with that, to be honest, mostly because we give them some examples that are contextually relevant to them, ideally. And that doesn't matter initially where you impart that. And by that I mean often these are done in seminars or webinars where the opportunity for the environment that we're talking about that has contextual relevance to that iwi member isn't even present. And therefore to discuss an ocean or a mountain without them being able to participate through their form of communication is one-sided. But you can start out with the delivery of mātauranga Māori, which is a knowledge base first. So we can hand over some of the information that might have that contextual relevance to that person that's in that area, whether they know that or not. And subconsciously or in terms of blood memory, often they do. Because that's the irony of what we're working at the moment is most of the answers are already there. Communities know this information, they just haven't heard it for a long time. So it's already there. And what we want to try and do is to shift them into the next phase of them engaging with that. Now that might still be in an urban environment, and that's okay still, because we can have them see what this information looks like and then start to engage with it by reading it, by listening to it, by asking questions about it or talking with their mates about it. It's the final phase, which is sometimes seen as the hardest, but probably the most pivotal, which is that shift into maramataka. Now, for some districts, it's sort of the opposite. They have maramataka, then mōhiotanga. Depends where you are. I know that Māori Marsden talks a lot about mōhiotanga being the final phase. But for other areas, it's maramatanga, it's the final phase. And why I'm telling you this part is that, and I spoke to you about this the other day, is that's dynamic capacity. That last phase is where people shift out of it being an academic, urban-based process into testing it themselves to see what comes out. It's the execution of a conceptual framework.
The application, yeah.
So I think that's kind of critical because a lot of our followers have forgotten that even when I speak about the idea that health isn't necessarily human-centered, it's still a metaphor. It's not like we stick a person in the center of a room and say, there we are, there's health, because you're in the middle of it. It's an idea. It's a metaphor. It's something that floats around and we apply it. So as Māori, a lot of our language is based around metaphor. The ways we engage are based around metaphor. That hua process is critical to us. So therefore, we've got to return to some of those ideas and think about the metaphor first and figure out the process before we get to the content. And that process is that ability to move from mātauranga Māori to mōhiotanga to maramatanga. Now in the final phase there, the maramatanga is the one that most people have the most difficulty with because you have to revisit it 3 or 4 times. If there's some of you online that have been around and I've talked to you before, you'll get this one because you've been out once and thought, oh, you know, this is me. And then you get home and you try and tell your mate and you go, oh, I don't know. It was this thing we did with this bro and it was mean. I loved it, but I don't know what it was. Revisit a couple of times and then you can explain 1 or 2 things. But the critical part is that they next move into not needing someone like us to be able to do that. They do it independently. And they do it as a direct connection to the environment. And that environment doesn't necessarily have to be rural all the time. the environment that they are in still provides plenty of platforms for the exercising of a philosophy that comes from a Mātauranga Māori beginning point. So any classroom I've been into in the city of Auckland, I can show them a spider in a corner and I can show what a spider will cause. We can read time from it, we can read weather changes from it, we can read behavior patterns, and it's a link back to the outdoor environment. When I step outside, I can show them shadows on the ground and how we can read seasonal changes by when that shadow turns up in that classroom at what time of the day for the whole year. And the kids can take a photo of that with 3 marking points to be able to show it. So there's multiple ways of doing it. It's just that I think we've forgotten as kaimahi, as Māori, what the application is in the final phase, which is that dynamic capacity or dynamic capability. Now, out of interest, I've been working on some areas here lately, and I've shown a few of these to you before, which are those causal loop diagrams. Now, they've come out of systems thinking, and what that shows in essence is one concept that a community will produce about something they want to change, and then they'll figure out what has to increase or decrease for that to occur. I work a fair bit in youth obesity. I don't have any interest in youth obesity. I just like being outside in the bush or in the water, which may contribute to that. So I'm happy doing that part of it without necessarily saying to a community, you're bad because you've got youth obesity. We can focus on the potential of the community by showing what resources they have that will allow a change as an outcome. Now, going into those places lets us do some things that are particular to a whakapapa way of understanding connections to environments and the consequent flow down into the individuals that we see in a school or in a community, and some of the benefits they might have. Those causal loop diagrams show that, for example, we may need to have less fast food joints that are closer to a school, which is an environmental structure that has an applied outcome. If you have less of that, then you're not going to have as much of people eating it. Another example I've seen around this one is near Manrurewa, one of the colleges out that way. There's a dairy that sells the most Coca-Cola of any shop in the country because all of the school kids walk past it on their way to school. So instead of talking about obesity, we can talk to the shopkeeper and say, well, as a causal outcome of you being placed here, which they purposely chose, we're asking whether they can only sell Coke to these kids after school or before school, but not during school times, or that they change some of the options that they have in their fridge, or they have more promotional material about water, or we do work in the school directly with the effects of Coke, and then there might be some changes in the environmental structures. But that's the causal loop kind of argument. What we've been moving into more recently is stock and flow. Yeah. I'm getting to the point on this one. We discussed this the other day. Stock and flow is a really interesting process that I've been looking at what our stocks are in terms of stock as an idea of what have we got right now, and flow as an inflow and outflow is how will that amount change? What will we do to it that will affect the change? Now, if we have a stock of knowledgeable people in Mātauranga Māori, how is that going to change? Now, some will die as our elders, our kaumātua, get to a point where they've lived their lives, and that stock of people who are well informed will drop down. But we may have some inflow that's coming from more students that are being educated through webinars and processes like this, so we might be able to lift that stock back up. The interesting part about this, and I spoke about it a moment ago about dynamic capability, is that actually the content might not matter. It's the process that we need to review to understand how we're going to increase those stocks and shift them from that space of just knowing these things into applying these things. And at the moment, if I had to hazard a guess, I'd say that's where we're weakest right now, is we don't have enough dynamic capability to encourage people to be independent deliverers of these concepts. Kapai?
I've kind of got it in my head, you know, like a pipeline where you've got your stock, and there's little valves or taps on it, and depending on how that's exactly what you said, it's about how we're able to have that knowledge, but then also apply it in that practical way when we're out in the communities, is the flow. Is that a good sort of analogy of it?
Yeah, by trying to understand how we can affect a building of potential people that will understand not only mātauranga Māori and not only te waiora o tāne or health applications, but a combination of both and the delivery of that. And that's a synthesis of both of those bodies of knowledge. What I found in the past is we have quite a few communities that are held up by thinking, this is mātauranga Māori, it came from my ancestors, I can't mess with it. It's got to stay the way it is, and that's all we're going to teach. And I've argued the other way, saying, well, no, we have different contemporary issues that affect us now that they never had exposure to. Just increased population alone, or climate change is massive. So we're seeing different effects in the behaviours of people that are around us. So we have to change to not only consider the past, but also contemporary issues, the way we engage with waiora now, and it's a production of a new body of knowledge coming out of both of those spaces that we're after. Once that body of knowledge is produced, then we have to figure out how to apply it. It's not enough to produce it. Probably that's where we're stuck, eh?
Ihi, I've got a question from Hariata. She's asking, how do we learn more about causal diagrams that apply Māori systems from afar?
Come on, Hariata, you already know the bloody answer to this. You're just asking questions that make it easy to make us look like we know what we're talking about.
Thanks, Hariata.
Yeah, here's your $20 out. Causal loop diagrams, our whakapapa diagrams in some parts almost connect to it, but it's not probably complex enough with a line to a particular group of people. You need to understand what those people then went on to achieve, and it might be that if you have a whakapapa diagram where there's hine tupare maunga tāne, and then we see a split into rakohore, rangahua, and so on, that you actually have to know what those people as environments represent to get some depth out of it. But a causal loop diagram allows us to head off in a whole range of different directions. Now, to get to the point, there's a free software program online called Stick-E. So Stick-E. It's out of Deakin University. From Stick-E, you can draw your own causal loop diagrams, and it shows you how to do it. The fellow that developed this is Professor Steve Allender. Choice fella, done some work with him lately. I'm off to meet up with these fellas again in another 10 days and discuss some of the stock and flow ideas, some of the causal loop diagrams. It's a mean opportunity to share some ideas with some international fellas working in the space. We're beginning with, and this is kind of interesting, Eamon, maybe for you, about tātou whakapapa issues. I'm working with a powerlifting group in San Diego that have just started to use maramataka concepts of trying to understand what the moon phases and the movement of water in San Diego is causing in their athletes, and trying to change their program to suit the requirements of the athletes. The athletes don't know this is happening, but they're trialing a different approach to it. Cool. And they said they've been blown away already with some of the outcomes from that. So we're going to visit with some of them. I'm going to talk to them about some of the tohu that we see in our environments, and to show how they could probably recognize some of those in their environments. There's 5 key ones in this area: how to read trees, how to read insects, how to read fish, how to read birds, and how to read weather movements. And from those, we can then predict what kind of performance outputs we're going to get in people. So maramataka, if you like, is modeling. Tohungatanga is noticing what those signs are that will lead to a particular modeling output. So that's a San Diego powerlifting group. From there, we head off to Minneapolis, and we're working with a First Nations group there. I'm going to shut up and Dario can talk soon, because I've been talking you to death. And he's got to say something, because we're getting a free lunch.
I guess I'm just thinking a little bit around when you're talking about some of the system change and moving sort of with the times, I guess. So some of the things that I've been thinking myself is about how the new generation of rangatahi and tamariki learn these days in terms of technology and other approaches, and the kaumātua perhaps feeling that they're not wanting to know that mātauranga anymore because they're not willing to learn it in the way that they have. Which is probably not the case. They still want to learn it, but they would much rather have some notes or have some form of interaction that's more than just sitting for a whole week at the marae on the Wānanga listening to the karaua kuia kōrero. So I think it's sort of getting across the line in terms of how you bring those two mediums together to create a new system or a new approach to that knowledge transfer, I think. So, yeah.
Is that acknowledging, you know, your stock, and then also there's some challenges about how it translates or flows. So, you know, you don't want to lose that, do you? So, we have to kind of think of ways that we can. Oh, well, everybody talks about it, isn't it? How you get that knowledge translation so that it's can be for everybody. Yeah. Yeah,
no, for sure. I think it's got a good point too that. Often, and this might be just a personal thing that I've been doing I've been in the outdoors ed space and talking with people in the bush for 35 years now. When I go to visit a location, I'll go to the mountain or the water first, then the people after that. So if I want to get the most purest form of knowledge about a place, it's going to come from how the water and the mountain behave towards me. So if I come across a mountain in an area and I go to visit and it's steep as all hell at the bottom, the people will often reflect that in the way they deal with you. They'll hold you, and then if you get past that, then they might let you come in. Or if it's really mellow at the bottom and it kind of weaves its way along and then gets steeper at the end, the people are sometimes like that as well. They'll welcome you in, ask you a lot of questions, and then throw you out. So there's different reflections that I get from environment. So when you're talking about, you know, having a week next to a kaumātua, often I'll have a week next to a river, and I'll learn quite a bit about our place, our people, from how the river behaves. And in that way, in my opinion anyway, it's a fairly pure and unadulterated way of connecting to place. And I love being able to do that because it gives me an experience that others don't necessarily know about. It's a secret way of knowing. And I think that's what we're trying to encourage more people to do, is to know the places that causes people and themselves to be the way they are. Now, quickly coming back to the other thing, after San Diego, Minneapolis, First Nations group there. Then we're up to the Menominee people on their reservation in Green Bay, which is Wisconsin. Then we're over to Montana University. The part I'm really looking forward to is I'm working with a group in Brookings Research Institute in Washington, D.C., and they're part of the subcommittee on minority health to the National Institute of Health. So this is for the whole country. First Nations people in the States only represent 1% of their population. African American, or I don't know what their names are now, it changes every bloody half hour like us sometimes. Sometimes they're black fellas, sometimes they're black Africans, sometimes they, I don't know, but you know the ones I'm talking about. They're 15 or 16%, which is closer to where we are. But they're not necessarily always seen as minority groups, whereas minority health is talking about Hawaiian, Inuit, and First Nations that are in the States. When we go over to talk with them, we're talking big scale intervention and capacity development, because they've got the clout to be able to make some fairly significant change. And I'm interested to see how they're trying to do that at the moment. So connecting up with them is an opportunity we get usually every year to go and discuss ideas with other places around the globe. With all humility, you fellas out there, Māori are highly regarded. We're seen as world leaders in indigenous health, even though when we're back here and we look at our neighbours and go, oh, babe, I don't know that you should take the lid off the salt and pour it on your meat. Or I don't think the butter's meant to be the same thickness as your bread. But when you talk to fellas overseas, they look to Māori for leadership, because we're not laying down to accept this. We're trying to affect change, and we're getting into our government's minds and messing with them, saying, not acceptable. So we have leadership opportunities and obligations globally. So I'm trying to encourage more of you fellas to do that. I've got another question up there from Bobby.
Yeah, from Bobby. Are you hoping to get whakapapa and Māori systems out into the mainstream world, or do you think it's better utilised when the opportunity arises? Do people need to be ready for it in order to use it? Kia ora, Bobby.
You want to have a shot, bro?
I think that's probably a good whakaaro in and around the previous question around people who are disconnected from their whakapapa. Do they need to be ready to use it? I would say yes. Without the mātauranga in and around, what the kaupapa is, they'll probably find it quite difficult to pursue more after they do get a taste for the kaupapa. Me personally, I think it can work for anyone. So those who are interested, and we do have a cohort in a large population of tauiwi and Pākehā and other opu from other areas who are really interested and willing to learn about the kaupapa, sometimes more so than our own people. So I think there's definitely an opportunity for it there. And what that looks like is probably a baby step sort of approach in terms of transferring that mātauranga, i.e. again, not sitting with the karawa and the marae for hours on end.
From my perspective, Bobby, I'm not suggesting or insisting that anybody does anything around this, but I'm looking at a whole range of different models of ways of knowing to see which ones might have some potential benefit for us. I see that dynamic systems thinking has access into some political arenas that we may not have yet. And being able to show those that make policy that we already understand systems thinking at a really high level gives us leverage. So it might be that in mainstream, their acceptance of these ways of thinking will then require them to understand that Māori also have this capacity. Because what I found in Aotearoa, which is different to offshore, is that some of our ideas aren't readily accepted. They're thought as, oh, you're Māori up to something again, kind of a novel idea, but anyway, and then they'll move on. So I think that there's some potential applications here for it. I've been working in schools. I'm working in 8 schools at the moment, 4 in South Auckland, where we're teaching schools, year 11s and 12s, how to build Google Earth virtual tours of their district that show how they can link to 5 or 6 locations specifically and link in which atua used to be there and which ones, or which are still there now, but more specifically, what types of physical activity used to be conducted there as a reflection of the mātauranga connected to that atua, and which models can be practiced now for physical activity and nutrition. So it allows us to do quite a range of things and interventions through systems thinking, which ironically is just whakapapa again.
That's an automatic connection into the mainstream world because you're utilizing a platform that is mainstream.
A lot of people have work from. Yeah.
Hey, now, I don't know whether you can see it or who can see it, but I put up a stock and flow diagram.
So you'll need to share your screen here. We've got a couple more minutes too, so if anybody's got any more questions, please do ask just before we finish off. If you share your screen here, it should come up hopefully. There you go.
You see that?
Yep, we can see that.
Cool. That there is one of our, I'm working with a fellow, Peter Holman from Washington University. He's a specialist in systems thinking, and I quite liked, can you still see that picture?
Carl, it went away.
Hang on a second. We'll try and get that one back to you as something that we'll finish off with for you. It shows our first iteration of stock and flow concepts and looks at cultural knowledge, looks at information that, no, it's not in that one, sorry. It's back on in the new one. Some concepts that we want to shift into proof of concept. Once we get to proof of concept, then we can show different government, we're still trying to bring that one back to you, different government groups, how we've been thinking about increasing our dynamic capability or capacity. If people are interested in that, because we're getting sent all over the place trying to get this picture back up, I can send that out to you. But suffice it to say, at the moment, that's the area I'm working in quite a bit, is to figure out how we can get to proof of concept phase. Might be able to bring it up from here again. It's this one here. Open that one.
You guys have got too many screens, isn't it?
Yep.
Is it coming up?
can't see that one?
No, we can't, sorry.
That's
what I can do is after the webinar we send out an evaluation to everybody, so I can put that in as part of the evaluation email. So, oh, here we go.
Yeah, you got them back?
Yep, we can see you.
Just to wrap up with that one there, you'll see on the left-hand side near the top there, that's our inflow, and figuring out how we develop more cultural knowledge and where we get a community of people that understand and know. The outflow on the other side is the knowledge decay. That's where we have people in the community that might die, kaumata that move on. Where it's got those lines crossing through some of the arrows, that means a delayed outcome, that we have to revisit it 2 or 3 times. But down the bottom there, you see that other box that says knowing how to use knowledge. That's the phase where I'm trying to increase, which is that dynamic capability. And you'll see that there's a number of lines there that have 2 slashes across it. That's to say we have to keep coming back to it to develop that capability. That's the phase that we're trying to shift into the next iteration to show proof of concept that we can then take to policy writers and say, actually what we need to work on is figuring out how we shift our people into understanding the processing of this and then the application of this. Kapai? I'm glad that there's been so many people bother to turn up. I'm humbled that I was asked to come along and speak. I appreciate my bro being here because he's prompted me a few times to talk about things because I'm never really sure what we're going to talk about when we stand up to speak.
Kia ora, Ihi. We've got a couple of more questions. We've got Te Riri says, thanks Ihi, important to wield my wairua identity so my ngākau tinana has a turanga waiwai. Kia ora. And Amon's keen to learn more about this. So I'll definitely send out a little package to everybody that's been on today. I can send, if it's okay with you, Ihi, that that document you just sent. And I think you spoke about, is it called Stick-E, a website to draw your own causal loops? Is that what it was?
Yeah. It's a slightly different style in that it has one big circle with other opportunities around the extremities of that circle to add in the factors that you think will change the outcome. But still, and it gives a overview of how to use it anyway.
Very cool. And I think I'll just check to see if we've got any more questions.
Also, Edna, there's that article. It's going to be coming out in a little while. I'm just trying to remember which journal we sent it to, but you've got a copy of it anyway on systems dynamics and whakapapa comparison. So that was an article I wrote maybe 3 or 4 months ago now, or reviewed. I wrote it a couple of years back actually. But this one we've sent off to a journal to be able to get it published. Hasn't been completed yet, but I think I'll give you copies, and if people want that, they can have a read of that before it's published.
That'll be fantastic. Thanks, Ihi. And also on our website, if you go into the Rangaho section, we've got a document that you produced last year, I think, Mātauranga Māori and System Dynamics, where old world collides with new.
Yeah.
So there's some information in there too.
Yeah.
Cool. Kia ora. Thank you, everybody. Thanks very much, Ihi, for, as always, for your rich kōrero. I always go away with a full mind, and I'm always trying to think about how I can now then apply that into the mahi that I'm doing as well. Thanks, Dario, for jumping in there as well, and thank you all to the participants for coming on. We've got another webinar happening in about 3 weeks' time, and that's with Dr. Sarah Jane Payne from the Auckland University, and she's talking to us about sleep. So be sure to jump in for that one when the registration comes round. So kia ora, everybody. Thank you very much. Cheers. Ka kite.
Kia ora.